wokish way, let's say.
Sure.
Anyway, let's speak to Caroline Farrow, who's columnist at Catholic Universe. Caroline, thank you so much for coming on the programme. Talk to me, first of all, about Pope Francis. We knew that he was suffering from various conditions. I think he had been hospitalised with pneumonia, and it'd gone quiet for a while. And then we learn on Easter Monday that he has indeed passed away. Talk to me about Pope Francis and his legacy.
Well, it's interesting because I was just laughing along with your jokes, although I was hardly disagreeing with Russell. And I think actually Pope Francis would have laughed at some of your jokes himself. He had a great sense of humour, and I think a lot of people are saying, what is his legacy going to be? And in some ways it's too early to say, because it's only when we have the benefit of hindsight, the perspective of history, that we can really put his legacy in context. But I think certainly one of the things he will be remembered for is this public ministry he had of humility and servitude. So he really wanted to very publicly live out his vocation of being yes, he was the leader of the church, but he was also, like all of us, a servant of Christ. So he eschewed a lot of the trappings of the papacy. So he didn't wear the red mozzetta, the cape, for example, is what it's called, that the Pope sort of traditionally wears. And he decided not to wear the red shoes, for example, that traditionally worn by a Pope. And he shocked everybody after he was elected by deciding to travel home on the bus instead of using the papal limousine. And I think this is very much going to be his legacy. Of some people found it quite performative, the way he really wanted to show that he was humble and he had humility and he was a servant. And also the way he very famously, very shortly after he became Pope, he said, "I want to be the Pope of surprises. I want to make a mess." And that's what he came in and did. And his vision of the Catholic Church was one as a field hospital. So he knew that the Catholic Church has this reputation. We have very strict doctrine, and that there are people who feel very alienated, as a result of their life circumstances. They feel unwelcome. So his ministry was all about reaching out to those peripheries and trying to make people who didn't feel included feel that they were included, and that the gospel message is for everybody. It's not just for a select few people who think of themselves as good.
I mean, the pomp and ceremony of the Catholic Church is something as an Anglican that I find very sort of foreign to me. I don't, I'm not up to date with how it all involves. I'm reading here the death of the Pope triggers a formal and lengthy period of mourning with many historic rituals, including certifying his death by calling out his name 3 times, sealing his apartment doors with red ribbons, breaking the papal ring with shears. There's certainly a lot of ritual surrounding the death of the Pope in Catholicism. And what you're saying is he would rather that wasn't necessarily the case. The popes get to choose their own papal name, I think, don't they?
They do, and of course that was a big break with tradition. Francis was the first pope to take that papal name, and he was after St. Francis of Assisi. But also Francis was a Jesuit. He was a priest of the Jesuit order, and he was the first pope from Latin America. He's although his parents were Italian, he was raised in Argentina. And there's a famous Jesuit saint called St. Francis Xavier, who did a lot of missionary work traveling to the East. And so there was this idea that Francis was going to sort of evangelize from West to East. And that showed, I think, from the moment that he stepped out on that balcony. I remember 12 years ago, I was commentating. I had my list of papabile, the papal candidates. And Francis stepped out onto the balcony, and everybody's jaws dropped in shock because he hadn't been considered to be a contender this time around. And we were sort of like, oh my goodness, we didn't have him on our sheet. And we all had to sort of do some quick cribbing. But going back to the pomp and circumstance, the rituals of the Catholic Church, this is from a time, of course, where we didn't have the internet and we didn't have newspapers, and things needed to be done in a very sort of structured and also transparent way. So the conclave and the tradition of the smoke, that's how people knew what was happening. And yes, the Pope used to have a lot more political significance than he does today. I mean, that's not to say he doesn't have political significance, but interestingly, Pope Francis has also pared down some of the funeral rituals. So, for example, previous popes would be their body would be laid on a catafalque, like a raised platform in the church. Pope Francis is going to have his body placed in his coffin on the floor. So that people can still file through and venerate, but he wants to be lowly. And again, there was this papal tradition that a pope would be laid in 3 coffins, one of oak, one of cedar, and one of lead. I'm sorry if I've got one of the woods wrong. Whereas now Pope Francis has asked that he's laid in just a single coffin of wood and zinc, and he's also eschewing another tradition. So normally popes would be buried in St. Peter's Basilica, St. Peter's Square in the centre of the Vatican, whereas Pope Francis has asked that he's buried in St. Mary Maggiore or St. Mary Major, which is a Catholic basilica, but it's I think it's in, sorry, I should know this. It's in Rome, but it's not right in the centre of the Vatican. And again, that's because he has a very personal devotion to Our Lady, Mary, so the Virgin Mother of God. So he's breaking these traditions. I mean, the thing I wonder, okay, is I'm not saying he's wrong to break these traditions, but then this makes it very difficult for a successor to come in and say, well, actually, I do want the red rosetta, I do want the red shoes, I do want this, not because they're wanting to be, a showman. They're not trying to be like, say, Jude Law. I don't know if you've seen the young Pope, but these traditions that Pope Francis got rid of, they do all have they're all very heavy, symbolic meanings, and it was just his style of papacy that decided to do away with that, which some of these trappings did get a lot of criticism, and people said, well, how is that related to Christ the humble carpenter? And I almost hope that a new pope does reinstate some of these traditions, because it can be an interesting teaching moment,
Right.
a moment of evangelization. But I think it will be hard for his successor.
I mean, talking about successors, there are a number of runners and riders, for want of a better phrase. Cardinal Turkson, who is a Ghanaian, was the bookies' favourite at one point when Francis was chosen in 2013. He would be the first black pope. And for those going, oh, well, DEI higher, my sense, I used to live in Ghana, actually. My sense, actually, is when you reach out to the Commonwealth and the developing world, you actually find a more sort of small c conservative view of how religion should take place. I mean, when I look through all of these names, there are plenty of men, septuagenarians and largely, who are supposed to be pitted to be the next pope. Does it really matter? How much does it matter where the pope comes from, what sort of pope they're going to be, whether they are a conservative pope, whether they are a liberalising pope? How much does this affect, do you think, the belief system of Catholicism that's spread around the world?
Well, it's interesting you mention that, because there's certainly, as you said, Cardinal Turkson, and a lot of people would like Cardinal Sarah as well, Cardinal Robert Sarah, but he's 79 and he's 80 next month, or he's 80 in June, so whether or not he could just sneak in. And also, I heard Russell mention an English pope. Timothy Radcliffe has recently been made a cardinal, so he could potentially be in the running as well. But he's very liberal. But it's true what you say about popes from the Commonwealth, particularly popes from Africa. I mean, let me tell you, there are so many candidates for the priesthood in Africa. They're actually sending them over to the UK. And it's really hard to become a priest in Africa, because the places at the seminary are very, very limited, whereas in the UK we have something of a vocations crisis. I don't think it really matters per se where the next pope comes from, although you're right. African Catholics tend to be very sort of small c conservative. I think what matters is that we have a pope that is a truly humble servant of God, a pope that wants to lead. And I think there's a lot as well of confusion or misunderstanding. People believe that whoever the pope is, that they can come in and sweep away Catholic teachings. They can change all the Catholic teachings that they don't like or makes them feel uncomfortable, whether that's on sort of sexuality, whether that's on marriage or gender ideology, whatever that might be. And in fact, no pope can do that. That's not within the pope's gift. It's not possible.
Is this not?
But however, I think it is important to make people realise that it doesn't matter what your background is. You're still welcome.
Is this not? Is this not the sort of? I mean, reading about Cardinal Sarah here, born in French Guinea, another possibility is the first black pope, but is essentially somebody who is far more conservative, has denounced gender ideology as a threat to society, spoke out against Islamic fundamentalism. Is it not that actually, the Pope shouldn't be a follower? The Pope is not there to sort of squish himself into the preordained confines of what society is being taught to believe in 2025, 2026, but to lead, to be the voice of God, to represent the religion and the fundamental teachings of that religion, not to say, how am I going to adapt what is inherent to this belief system to what is now being spread in society. And we can see very quickly how a set of ideology, if you will, can last as long as, a can of evaporated milk in your pantry. We've seen the Supreme Court ruling getting back to common sense and going, women are biologically women. Of course, and yet how we were all swept up in the madness and having to change our language and having to make apologies for even deigning to utter those words just a few weeks ago. And surely what people in the Catholic Church are crying out for, as I believe are Anglicans when we look at the Church of England, is someone to say, this is the Bible, this is the teaching of Christianity, not how do we squish this and shape this and mould this like a cheap tub of plasticine into something that might be more attractive to more people.
I think that's right. The role of the Pope is, and the Church is to be timeless, universal truth, not to sway with the zeitgeist. And in fact, Pope Francis was very, very outspoken on gender ideology. He called it evil. He called it satanic. He compared it to sort of Nazi ideology being taught in classrooms. And I remember once, very funnily, I quoted him on social media, and a notorious trans activist then tweeted at Pope Francis and said, "Oh, this Catholic, she's saying this," and I was just laughing, thinking, well, I'm actually just paraphrasing what the Pope himself has said. But I think as well it's interesting because you touch on that religion, Christianity doesn't fit neatly into a left-right political praxis. And a lot of people say religion and politics should be separate. I kind of I disagree.
I was going to say, Henry VIII kind of thought that.
It's our faith that informs the political decisions we make.
Right.
So Pope Francis spoke about migrants, which obviously, and immigration, which obviously upset some people. But I think what he said was important because we have to remember, in and amongst all the debates we have about immigration and migrants and, what countries' policies should be, there are vulnerable human beings at the centre of this who have the same dignity and rights as we all do. So we need to be very careful, and I think the Pope was trying to remind us of that. We need to be very careful when we're talking about such a heated topic that these are human beings at the centre of this debate. These are human beings with dignity and rights. We need to be careful not to dehumanise them. But to bring this back to a local level, in the UK, we currently have we have the debate about assisted suicide, right?
Yes.
We have a general election coming up in Runcorn, and Catholics will be asking the candidates in that particular election. It doesn't matter what political party they're from, but the Church is speaking out very strongly about assisted suicide. So Catholics will be informed by their faith to say, okay, this guy, I don't know, this guy may be from a political, or this girl might be from a political party I don't normally support, but actually the first most important vote they're going to have is on assisted suicide.
Right.
How are they going to vote? And so our politics, our faith, does inform our politics and how we vote. And the same in
Without
the
a doubt,
local
yeah.
elections. So, for example, in the local elections, we need to ask if candidates are going to give lots of money to Pride, for example, or are going to support, dodgy RSHE policies in schools. Are they going to spend money on rainbow crossings, whatever? So, actually our faith does inform how we vote, and this is where the leader of the Catholic Church still has influence and sway. And of course, I think what people aren't aware of is the Catholic Church does undertake an awful lot of diplomacy. It is behind the scenes diplomacy.
Yeah.
But when we had the WikiLeaks scandal 10 years ago, we saw quite how involved the Vatican had been in various negotiations. So
and we forget, of course, don't we? Because by and large, we were once. I'm not saying people aren't Catholic in this country. My church is behind the oratory, actually. But we have sort of we went through that sort of thorny schism here in the United Kingdom. But Catholicism, of course, is the predominant religion of many of our neighbouring countries in Europe. I'm going to have to say goodbye to you now. Caroline, thank you ever so much for your insights. It's been fascinating talking to you. And when you come to that religion, that schism between the religion and democracy, if you will. I mean, we talk about how we went through that under Henry VIII. By and large, ironically, we now have a national religion based upon a man wanting to, get rid of a wife and upgrade her. Not to downspeak the church of which I'm a member. But, Jesus fundamentally said, didn't he, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's? How do we marry the two? Interesting conversations are going to be happening over the next few weeks about who is going to become the next pope, what that means for the spread of Christianity.